February 2020. The world didn't know it yet, but this would be Kirk Douglas's final on-camera conversation. At 103 years old, sitting in his Beverly Hills home, the man who once commanded Hollywood's biggest stages could barely speak above a whisper. His stroke from 1996 had stolen the thunderous voice that made Spartacus an eternal symbol of freedom that had captivated audiences for 7 decades. But now, in this last interview, something remarkable emerged from that weathered voice. Not bitterness or regret alone, but wisdom. The kind of hard-earned understanding that only comes from living more than a century and finally seeing your life with complete clarity. The camera rolled. His weathered hands rested calmly on the armrest. And then he began to speak about what it really meant to be Kirk Douglas, one of Hollywood's greatest legends. But to understand the profound nature of what he said, you need to know the extraordinary journey that brought him to that moment. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel for more Hollywood histories that celebrate the complexity of legendary lives. The interview was scheduled for 10 in the morning, when Kirk Douglas was at his sharpest. Sarah Mitchell, the veteran entertainment journalist, had documented Kirk's career for decades. She'd seen him transform from Hollywood's fierce leading man into an elder statesman of cinema. But this morning felt different. And Biden's, Kirk's wife of 65 years, and the woman who'd stood beside him through every triumph and challenge, greeted Sarah with a gentle warmth. "He's ready to talk today," and said with a knowing smile. Really talk. After 103 years, he finally has the perspective to tell his story completely. The living room was filled with golden morning light streaming through windows that overlooked a meticulously maintained garden. Kirk sat in his favorite chair, positioned perfectly to see both nature's beauty and his guests. At 103, his body showed the inevitable marks of time, but those legendary blue eyes sparkled with the same intelligence and intensity that had made him one of cinema's most magnetic performers. Sarah could see him observing the camera setup with the trained eye of someone who understood filmmaking from every angle. When everything was ready, Kirk raised one hand in a gesture that was both welcoming and commanding. "I know what people expect," he said, each word carefully formed despite his stroke-affected speech. The standard farewell interview. Career highlights. Life lessons. He paused, and something like mischief flickered across his face. "But I think we can do better than that. I think, after 103 years, I've earned a right to tell the whole truth." Sarah leaned forward with genuine interest. "What truth would you like to share, Kirk?" The question opened a door to something more thoughtful than either had planned. Kirk's expression grew reflective. "I want to talk about what it meant to live the American dream," he began. "Not the sanitized version, the real one, with all its glory and all its costs." He looked past Sarah toward the garden, gathering his thoughts. "I was born Isser Danilovich in 1916. My parents were illiterate Russian Jewish immigrants. My father collected rags for pennies. We were so poor that poverty doesn't quite capture it. But America gave me something miraculous, the ability to completely reinvent myself." Sarah could hear the emotion in his voice as he continued. "I became Kirk Douglas. I learned to act, to command attention, to project power. And I was good at it. Really good. Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s was the most competitive, most ruthless, most extraordinary place in the world. If you wanted to succeed, you had to be tougher, smarter, more driven than everyone else." Kirk's hands moved expressively despite their tremor. "I fought for every role. I turned myself into a producer when the studios tried to control me. I made Spartacus happen through sheer willpower when everyone said it couldn't be done. That film broke the blacklist and changed Hollywood forever. I'm proud of that. Genuinely proud." Sarah sensed they were approaching something important. "But success at that level must have come with challenges," she said carefully. Kirk nodded slowly. "That's the part one want people to understand," he said. "Not as an excuse, as context for understanding how that world worked." He took a breath, choosing his words with visible care. "In the Hollywood I knew, the studio system created an environment where power was everything. Directors had absolute authority. Producers controlled careers with a word. Stars like me, we had influence that's hard to imagine today. That system created incredible art. The golden age of cinema came from that structure, but it also created dynamics that were, let's say, problematic by modern standards. Kirk paused, and Sarah could see him wrestling with how to continue. I was demanding on set, very demanding. I expected perfection because that's what great art requires. Did it sometimes cross into being too harsh? Yes, absolutely. In those days, we called it professionalism. Today, you might call it something else. The line between pushing for excellence and pushing too hard, I probably crossed that line more times than I can count. His honesty was startling in its directness. But here's what I want young people to understand. We were creating masterpieces. Spartacus, Champion, Lust for Life, these films changed cinema. They required everything from everyone involved. Was that fair? Maybe not. But it was how extraordinary art got made in that era. Sarah felt they were approaching the heart of the interview. Are there specific things you wish you'd done differently? She asked. The silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if Kirk was gathering strength or reconsidering his words. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but firm. There were relationships that suffered. Kirk said carefully. Professional relationships, personal ones. My first marriage ended in part because I prioritized my career over everything else. My children, especially Michael, they grew up with a father who was often absent, often demanding, not always present in the ways they needed. Kirk's eyes grew distant with memory. There were women, actresses, and others I worked with where the power dynamic was complicated. In the 1950s and 60s, Hollywood operated under different social codes. What was considered acceptable then, what we thought of as normal interaction, the lines are different. I'm not saying that makes everything right. I'm saying the world has evolved, and thank God for that evolution. He looked directly at Sarah now. If I caused pain to people, if my drive for excellence or my personal failings hurt anyone, I wish I could apologize to each one individually. Some I did manage to reach in later years. Others I'll never know. Kirk shifted slightly, and Sarah could see and watching from the doorway, ready to assist if needed. The stroke in 1996, Kirk said, that changed everything. Suddenly I couldn't speak. I, who had made my living with my voice, with projecting power through words, I was silenced. It was terrifying, but it was also, strangely, a gift. A slight smile crossed his face. For the first time in my life, I had to listen, really listen. And my children, they could finally tell me things I'd never stopped to hear before. I learned that being strong doesn't mean being hard. That power wielded gently is still power, often more effective power. Sarah was moved by his candor. It sounds like you experienced real transformation, she said. Kirk nodded emphatically. The last 24 years have been about becoming a better version of myself. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. I donated millions to causes I believed in. I wrote books where I tried to be honest about my failures as a father, as a husband, as a man. I worked to repair relationships I damaged. Did that erase the past? No, but it meant something to try. His voice grew stronger with conviction. That's what I want people to understand. We're all works in progress. The measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes, it's whether they learn from them. Sarah decided to address the larger context. Hollywood has been reckoning with its past in recent years, she said. How do you see that conversation? Kirk took a moment before responding thoughtfully. I think it's necessary and overdue, he said. The studio system I knew created extraordinary art, but it also created power imbalances that hurt people. The fact that we're finally talking about consent, about professional boundaries, about treating everyone on set with dignity regardless of their position, that's progress. Real progress. He leaned forward slightly. But I also think we need to be careful about applying 2020 standards to 1950. Not to excuse genuine wrongdoing, but to understand context. In my era, the relationship between stars and studios, between directors and actors, between men and women in professional settings, all of that operated under different rules. Some of those rules needed to change. They have changed. That's good. But I resist the temptation to say everyone from my generation was a monster. We were products of our time, doing what we thought was right with the understanding we had then. The interview had now lasted over an hour, and Sarah could see Kirk tiring but remaining engaged. "What do you want people to remember about your life?" she asked. Kirk's response was immediate and clear. "I want them to remember that I was complicated. Like everyone is complicated. I made great art that brought joy to millions. Spartacus still matters. The films still matter. I also made mistakes, hurt people, prioritized the wrong thing sometimes. Both things are true. I was extraordinarily blessed to live the American dream, to go from the worst poverty to unimaginable success. And I paid prices for that success that took me decades to fully understand." He paused, emotion evident in his voice. "I want people to know that growth is possible at any age. I'm still learning at 103. I learned to be a better husband to, and who deserved better from me earlier. I learned to be present for my children and grandchildren. I learned that admitting your failures doesn't diminish your successes. It makes them more meaningful because they came from a real human being, not a perfect icon." Kirk looked directly at the camera now, speaking to audiences beyond the room. If you're watching this and you've made mistakes, know that it's never too late to try to do better. I'm proof of that. And if you've been hurt by people in power, know that many of us from that era are finally understanding what we should have understood then. The world is changing, slowly but changing. As the interview concluded, Sarah felt privileged to have witnessed something remarkable. Not a confession of sins, but a thoughtful, nuanced reflection from someone who'd lived long enough to see his life from multiple angles. Kirk's energy was clearly depleted, but his eyes remained bright. "Thank you for giving me the space to say these things," he told Sarah. "At my age, you realize that honesty is the only thing left that matters. Not protecting your image, not curating your legacy, just telling the truth as you understand it and hoping that means something." And came to help Kirk back to his room, and Sarah noticed the tender way they moved together, a partnership forged over 6.5 decades. As Sarah gathered her equipment and touched her arm gently, "He's been thinking about this conversation for years," and said quietly, trying to find the right words to express something very complex. "I hope you'll help people understand the fullness of who he was, both the brilliance and the humanity." Sarah promised she would, knowing she'd witnessed something precious, a man at peace with his complicated legacy. Kirk Douglas died 12 days after that interview, on February 5th, 2020. He was 103 years old, having lived a life that spanned an entire century of American history. When Sarah's interview aired, the response was thoughtful and varied. Some viewers appreciated Kirk's honesty about his failings while maintaining pride in his achievements. Others debated whether his reflections went far enough or perhaps went too far in either direction. Film critics noted that his movies, particularly Spartacus and Champion, remained powerful works of art regardless of their creators' personal complexities. Michael Douglas spoke publicly about his father's final interview, saying it captured the man he'd come to know in Kirk's later years, someone who'd evolved from the driven, sometimes difficult father of his childhood into a wiser, gentler presence. "He never stopped being Kirk Douglas," Michael said. "That force of personality, that intensity, it was who he was. But he learned to channel it differently, to use it for good, to acknowledge when it had caused harm. That takes courage, especially when you're one of the most famous men in the world." In the months following Kirk's death, his legacy was examined and re-examined through various lenses. His films were celebrated in retrospectives that acknowledged both their artistic merit and the era that produced them. His philanthropic work, his breaking of the Hollywood blacklist, his pioneering of independent production, these achievements stood as genuine contributions to cinema and society. At the same time, conversations continued about the power dynamics of old Hollywood, about how the system that created magnificent art also created environments where power could be abused, where professional boundaries were unclear, where success often came at human costs. Kirk Douglas's final interview became a touchstone for these discussions because it refused simple categorization. He hadn't portrayed himself as either purely heroic or purely villainous. He'd presented himself as human, complex, capable of both creation and error, shaped by his era, but also responsible for his choices. This nuanced self-portrait felt more honest than either hagiography or condemnation. It suggested that maybe the way to understand the giants of Hollywood's golden age wasn't to worship them blindly or cancel them completely, but to see them as fully human, products of their time, who also shaped their time. The question Kirk's interview posed, the one that continues to resonate, is how we hold multiple truths about a person simultaneously. Kirk Douglas was a genuine talent whose performances changed cinema. Kirk Douglas fought against political persecution when it was dangerous to do so. Kirk Douglas built a career of remarkable longevity and influence. Kirk Douglas was also demanding, sometimes cruel in his drive for perfection, operating within a system that granted him enormous power with minimal accountability. All these things are true. The challenge isn't choosing which truth to believe, it's learning to hold all of them at once. In his final interview, Kirk seemed to understand this complexity fully. He didn't ask for forgiveness or claim redemption. He didn't minimize his achievements or his failures. He simply said, at 103 years old with complete clarity, this is who I was. This is what I did. This is what I learned. This is what I hope you'll take from my story. It was neither an apology nor a justification, but something rarer, an honest accounting from someone who'd lived long enough to see himself clearly. Whether that accounting satisfies every viewer, whether it should satisfy them, those remain open questions. But the honesty itself, the willingness to be complicated and human rather than perfect and legendary, that stands as Kirk Douglas's final gift to a world that had loved, criticized, and ultimately tried to understand him. His 103 years gave him perspective few people ever achieve. And in using that perspective to tell a truth that was neither simple nor comfortable, Kirk Douglas remained, to his final days, exactly what he'd always been. An extraordinary force who refused to be anything less than himself, in all that word's complicated glory.